They left her roped to the saloon rail with a card reading, "No man's wife." The rope was hemp, old and dark with handling, and whoever tied it knew what they were doing. Double wrapped at the wrist, looped through the iron ring they hitched horses to. She was standing straight, that was the first thing I noticed. Not slumped, not crying. Standing straight in a dress that had been blue once, her hair half down from whatever she'd pinned it with that morning, and a piece of brown cardboard hanging from a cord around her neck with those 4 words written in tar. I came down off the ridge about 2 in the afternoon. I'd been up since before light working a line of fence that the association wanted moved, and I was dusty through to the skin, and my horse needed water and I needed whiskey, or in that order or the other, I didn't much care. I rode into Garnet the way I always rode into Garnet, slow, watching the roof lines out of old habit, letting my eyes come down to street level gradual like you peel back a bandage. There were men on both sides of the Meridian's porch. 7, maybe 8. The kind of stillness that means they'd been there a while, and were waiting to see what happened next. I pulled up. She didn't look at me. She was looking straight down the street at nothing, jaw set, and I could see from 30 feet that her wrists had swelled some already against the rope. I knew who she was. Ruth Connell, widow of Pete Connell, who'd run a small spread 4 miles south of town until he drowned crossing Arrowhead Creek 2 springs back. After Pete went, she'd done what women with 40 acres and a leaking roof do, kept on. Sold what she could. Took in mending. People in town said she was proud about it, said it like proud was a failing. I knew the men on the porch too. Dahlin's crew mostly. Cal Dahlin ran the largest outfit in the basin, which meant he ran most everything else besides, and he had a way of making things legal after the fact by the time anyone thought to look. 3 months back his foreman, a man named Reese, had ridden out to the Connell place and made her an offer on the land. I don't know what number he put on it. I know what 40 acres in that bottom ground was worth, and I know Dahlin's reputation for arithmetic. Whatever she said back to Reese, it hadn't been yes. I sat my horse and looked at the card around her neck. No man's wife. Meaning nobody'd stop them. I got down, tied my horse at the far end of the rail away from her, so the animal was between us and the porch, unbuckled my saddlebag and took out my knife. Not a long knife. A short one with a bone handle I'd carried since before most of these men were born, good for cutting rope or cutting meat. I walked to her. One of the men on the porch said, "That's association business, Horn, ride on." I didn't look at him. I looked at her wrists and I cut the rope. She didn't say anything, didn't thank me or cry or fall against me. She pulled the card over her head and dropped it in the dirt. And she stood there rubbing one wrist with the other hand, and her eyes finally came to me and they were gray, the kind of gray that's got some dark underneath it. "You know what you're starting," she said. "Yeah," I said. I didn't mean it as brave. I meant it the way you mean it when you've been riding the same territory long enough that you see a thing coming before it gets there, and you just say the word out loud so it's named. My name is Alton Spear, and I am going to tell you this straight. I was not a young man then. I was 51 years old, and I had spent most of those years doing other people's difficult work for them, tracking men, moving cattle across hard country, enforcing agreements that the men who made them didn't want to enforce themselves. I was good at it. I am not bragging when I say that. It was like saying a saw is good at cutting. It's just the thing it does. What I want you to understand is what I was when I rode into Garnet that afternoon. I was not looking for anything. I was not lonely in a way I'd have admitted. I had a line shack 12 miles out, and a horse I liked better than most people and a Springfield rifle that hadn't let me down in 22 years, and I had made a kind of peace with what my life was and wasn't. You do that at 51. You stop expecting the thing you stopped expecting, and you find out that the absence of it doesn't kill you like you thought it might when you were younger. I cut that rope because it was wrong to leave it tied, that's all. If I'd known what would follow, I'd have cut it just the same. The men on the porch let me alone that first day. Dahlin wasn't among them, and none of them were willing to start something without Dahlin there to say he wanted it started. That's how it is with men who take their nerve from someone else's account. They're brave in aggregate and careful alone. I walked Ruth Connell to the hotel, the only one in Garnet, and I spoke to the woman at the desk, a Mrs. Haas, and I put $3 on the counter and said Mrs. Connell would need a room for the night and her supper sent up. Mrs. Haas looked at the $3 and then at Ruth and then at me, and you could see her working the math of it, what it would cost her socially to take the money. I watched her face settle. "Room's $4, Mrs. Haas said. I put down another dollar. Ruth said from behind me, "I don't need your money, Mr. Spear." "No," I said, "but you need a room and your wrists seen to and something to eat, and right now I'm the one who has $4. We can argue the principle later." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." That was the whole of it, no dramatics. I went and had my whiskey, ate at the counter of the chop house, and rode out before dark. I came back the next morning because I was curious how she'd gotten home, whether Reese or any of Dahlin's men had followed her out to the place. I told myself that was why. She was there at the Connell place. The place was small, a house that needed its front step rebuilt, a barn with one good wall, a garden patch that was doing better than the buildings around it. Chickens, a sorry-looking mule that perked up when my horse came through the gate. She came out of the house carrying a bucket, and when she saw me she stopped. "You checking your work?" she said. "Something like that." She looked at me the way a woman looks at a man when she's deciding whether he's going to be a problem or a help, and she doesn't intend to be wrong about it. I held still and let her look. "There's coffee," she said finally, and went inside. The coffee was thin and I drank it, and I looked around the kitchen. It was clean, meager and clean, a tin shelf with flour and salt and very little else, a cast iron pan that had been used so many times it had gone almost black. "Reese came back," she said. She was sitting across from me, both hands around her cup. Her wrists had gone purple under the skin where the rope had been. "Last night, not to do anything. To tell me Mr. Dahlin was offering one more time, and if I didn't sell, I should know that the next thing that happened to me wouldn't be a piece of rope in town where people could see." I drank my coffee. "What do you want to do?" I said. She looked up from her cup. "Stay, it's Pete's land, it's my land, I worked it." A pause. "I'm not leaving." I nodded. "All right," I said. "You keep saying that," she said. "All right, like it settles something." "Doesn't it?" She studied me. "You're going to help me?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "Why?" I thought about it. A man who's been alone long enough can forget how to explain his own motives to someone else, because he stopped having to. I turned the cup in my hands. "Because they were wrong to do what they did to you," I said. "And because Dahlin's had this valley by the throat long enough, and somebody ought to say so, and I've got nothing to lose by it being me." She was quiet. Then, "That's the first honest answer I've gotten from a man in 2 years. I'm not going to make a romance out of what came next. It wasn't a romance. It was work." I moved my gear out to the Connell place that week. Not into the house. I took the barn, fixed up a corner of it, and that was where I slept. If anyone in town had something to say about that arrangement, they were welcome to come out and say it to my face. Nobody did. I rebuilt her front step, fixed the barn wall, restrung the fence on the south side where it had gone slack, and some of her chickens were getting through. I'm not a carpenter by nature, but I'm careful and I don't quit on a thing, and by the end of the second week, the place looked less like it was apologizing for existing. She worked alongside me. That surprised me, although it shouldn't have. She was not a woman who watched while somebody else did her labor. She'd get up before me. I could hear her in the morning starting the stove, and she'd already have the chickens fed and whatever needed doing in the garden done before I came in for coffee. She was quick with her hands and she didn't make noise while she worked, which I respect in a person. What we talked about over those first weeks was mostly the place, what needed to be done in what order and what could wait, practical talk. She knew the land better than I did, knew where the soil went soft in wet years, knew which corner of the pasture got shade in the afternoons and would be better for summer grazing. I listened. I asked questions. I think she was a little surprised by that, a man asking questions rather than telling. Reese came out twice. The first time I was on the roof patching the south slope and I could see him from up there, coming up the road with two others. He stopped at the gate and looked at me on the roof and I looked back at him, and that was the whole of that visit. The second time, a week later, I was in the yard and she came to stand beside me when he rode up. Side by side, not touching. He looked at us for a long time. "Dahlon's getting impatient," he said. "Dahlon can get whatever he likes," I said. Reese looked at Ruth. "You know what you're doing to yourself, keeping company with a man like this." She said, "I know exactly what I'm doing." Reese left. I heard what she'd said and I didn't say anything about it, but I'll tell you I felt it. In my chest, somewhere under the sternum, the way you feel a thing you weren't expecting. What Dahlon did next was legal, in the sense that the courts were his. He filed a claim disputing Pete Connell's original deed, said there was an error in the survey, which there might have been. Surveys in this country were often wrong by design. He got a judge in the county seat who owed him to issue a freeze on the property. Ruth couldn't sell, couldn't take a loan against it, couldn't do much of anything official with the place while the claim was in dispute, which could take 6 months or a year or as long as Dahlon wanted it to. I'd been through this before with other people's land in other valleys. I knew the shape of it. I wrote 2 letters, one to a lawyer in Denver I'd done business with, a man named Crail, who had no affection for large cattle operations, because a large cattle operation had once ruined his uncle. The other letter went to a newspaper, the one in the county seat, whose editor I'd once helped out of a difficulty I will not go into here. I told the editor that Dahlon had just rooted a widow off 40 acres of prime bottom ground by tying her to a saloon post in public view, and that the story, properly written, would sell papers. Then I waited, which is most of what work like this is. Ruth and I fell into a rhythm those weeks. Mornings were work, afternoons were more work, evenings were the porch. She'd gotten into the habit of coming out after supper with her mending, and I'd smoke my pipe and we'd sit and watch the light come down off the ridge. We didn't talk much in those hours. I'm not a man who needs to fill silence, and she seemed to feel the same, which is rarer than it ought to be. One evening she said, out of nowhere, "Did you ever marry?" "No," I said. "Why not?" I thought about it, knocked the pipe against the rail. The life I had wasn't a life you could ask someone to share, moving all the time, other men's trouble. She was quiet for a bit. "Pete used to say you were the best man with a rifle and a horse he'd ever seen. He met you once years ago." "I remember Pete," I said. "He'd been a solid, quiet man, the kind who didn't get enough credit for the work he did. He said you were the kind of man who'd give everything to see a thing done right, and never stop to wonder what you were owed for it." I didn't say anything. "I think he meant it as a compliment," she said. I took it as one. She had her mending in her lap and she was looking out at the ridge, at the last of the color going out of it. "I wonder what Pete would think of all this," she said. "Not sad, exactly. The way you wonder about someone you miss, which is different from grief." "I think he'd be glad somebody was here," I said. She looked at me then, those gray eyes in the last of the light. "I think so too," she said. Crail sent a man from his office, a young fellow named Purtell who wore a derby hat that was wrong for the country and carried a leather case full of papers. Purtell went through the deed and Pete's original survey and the county records, and at the end of a week he said the dispute was thin. Dahlon's lawyer had found a genuine surveying error, but it was in Dahlon's claim, not Ruth's. The boundary he was disputing had actually been filed correctly. It would take 6 months to unwind in court, maybe more, but Purtell said he could get an injunction against the freeze in the meantime. The newspaper story ran. The editor knew his business. He didn't name me. He didn't have to. He quoted 3 people in Garnet who'd been standing on the street when it happened and had opinions about what they'd seen and what sort of man Dahlin was and what sort of valley they lived in. He described the rope and the card. He ran it on the front page with a line drawing of a woman at a hitching post. Dahlin came to see me after that, not Reese. Dahlin himself, which told me the story had done what I wanted it to do. He came out to the Connell place alone, which was either confidence or stupidity, and he was on a good horse and dressed in the way men with money dress when they want you to feel the money. He was maybe 60, with a thick gray mustache and the deep-set eyes of a man who'd been calculating his whole life. He sat his horse at the gate and looked at me and said, "You understand you've made an enemy." "I've had enemies," I said. "Not like me." I thought about all the men I'd tracked and all the men I'd stood against and all the various types of confidant I'd encountered in 51 years. "Maybe," I said. "We'll see." He looked past me at the house. Ruth was in the doorway, not hiding, just standing there. "She's not worth it," he said. "That's not for you to decide," I said. He looked at me for a long time, the way men like him look when they're used to being the one who outlasts the other man's stare. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the road, and I watched him go. Ruth came to stand beside me. We watched until he was over the rise. "He'll try something else," she said. "Probably." "You're not worried?" I looked at the road where he'd gone. I'm always some kind of worried, keeps me sharp. She made a small sound, almost a laugh. I looked at her. There was something in her face I hadn't seen before, something that had been tight, releasing a little. She reached out and put her hand on my arm, not dramatic about it, not a statement, just a hand on an arm, the way you touch something solid to make sure it's there. "Thank you, Alton," she said. I put my hand over hers and we stood like that a moment, looking at the empty road, the light coming down long and gold across the pasture. The legal business took the better part of that year. Purtell got his injunction. Dahlin's lawyers maneuvered and Crail's man maneuvered back, and twice there were hearings in the county seat that Ruth and I both went to, sitting in a wooden courtroom while men argued over lines on a piece of paper. Ruth sat straight through all of it, in the same blue dress. It had been washed enough times now that it had faded even from what it was, and she answered the questions put to her in a clear, flat voice without embellishment. On the second trip, riding back on the stage, she fell asleep against my shoulder. She'd been awake since before light. I sat still and let her sleep. The country rolled past the stage window, dry and big and permanent-looking in the way this country always looked to me, like it had no intention of being hurried by anything human. I thought about what Pete Connell had said about me, that I gave everything to see a thing done right and never wondered what I was owed. I thought he was mostly correct. But sitting there with the weight of her head on my shoulder, I thought about owing for the first time in a long while. Not what I was owed. What I owed. What a man accrues toward another person when he's spent enough time beside them that he started to shape his mornings around whether they've slept, and whether the coffee's ready, and whether they smiled at something he said. I hadn't intended it. That was the truth of it. I had not intended anything but cutting a rope. Crail wrote in October to say the deed dispute had been ruled in Ruth's favor. Dahlin could appeal, and did, and lost again in the spring. By then the story had been picked up by 2 more papers, and Dahlin had enough other troubles. A water rights case over in the next county, a contract dispute with the railroad, that the Connell place had become more expensive to pursue than it was worth. The morning we got the final letter, Ruth made eggs and biscuits, which she didn't usually do on weekdays, and we ate at the table in the kitchen with the back door open and the May air coming in. She read the letter twice and then set it down flat on the table. "It's over," she said. "It's over," I said. She sat with it a moment. The chickens were making their noise outside, a meadowlark somewhere working through its whole song. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right." She put both hands flat on the table, the way she did when she was going to say something she'd thought out. "You came here last August to cut a rope, and you ended up staying a year. I need to know if that was—" She stopped, started again. "I need to know if you're going to leave now that there's nothing left to fix." I looked at her hands on the table. "I don't know what I'd go back to," I said. "The shack is falling down by now probably. The association's got 3 younger men who'll do what I used to do for less money and no argument." I looked up at her. "I'm 52 years old and I'm better at this. And I meant the fence and the chickens and the kitchen and the sitting on the porch than I ever thought I'd be. I'd like to stay if you'll have me." She looked at me for a long time. Those gray eyes. And then something in her that had been braced for a long time came down, slow and complete, and she leaned forward across the table and she put both her hands on my face, the way you hold something you mean to keep. "I'll have you," she said. "Alton, I'll have you." Her palms were warm and I sat very still, and outside the meadowlark was still at it, not knowing or caring about anything except getting the song right. There were people in Garnet that winter who had things to say about an old range detective living out at the Connell place, and some who said we weren't married, which was their business less than they thought it was, and some who said I'd only done it for the land, which made Ruth laugh in a way that told me what she thought of that. We were married in April in the front room of the house, with the circuit preacher and Mrs. Haas, and a rancher named Aldecoa from the south end of the valley who'd been friendly to Ruth all along. It was a short ceremony. Nobody made speeches. Afterward we stood out on the repaired front step. I'd replaced it twice by then. The wood keeps wanting to rot in that corner, and Aldecoa shook my hand with both of his and told me I was a lucky man, which I knew, and the preacher said something about Providence, which I let pass. When everyone had gone, Ruth stood next to me on the step, and we looked out at the yard and the barn and the pasture beyond, and the ridge going blue in the evening. The chickens had put themselves to bed already. The mule was dozing against the fence. She slipped her hand into mine. It's a small hand, Ruth's hand, and it fits against mine in a way that still catches me off guard sometimes, the way a thing fits when it was made for it. I had not expected this. I had not expected any of it. The ridge darkened and the first stars showed, and we stood there a while, not going in yet, holding what we had.